on 938 Live. This is Talkback.
All right, and we've got a great crowd here already at Key 18 at Lau Pa Sat. Thank you so much, all of you, for showing up today. We are talking about very important issues that I know keep some of us awake at night. How can all of us be better assured of security in retirement? Now, from next year, the public sector will be extending the re-employment age to 67. While we may be able to work longer, I'm sure not all of us actually want to, right? However, with the high cost of living, I know that many of you feel you have no choice. Meeting your retirement needs, indeed, is challenging. And we've got many good people working here today to make this event a success as well, whom I'm sure some have already passed the retirement age. Many thanks, of course, to the people at Lau Pa Sat for hosting us today. We've got breakfast for everyone as well, courtesy of Mugiho Bakery, and a coffee brewing in the background as we talk about whether or not we can indeed make CPF work better for all of us to meet our retirement needs. Now, lately, some people have suggested there should be a cap on how much of your CPF funds you can use for housing and other needs, of course, things like education and healthcare, just so that you will have more for retirement. If this means lowering your expectations of the type of home you live in, would you accept it? What would that really do to property prices as well? So we're going to be talking all about this with our guests and you, of course, who have joined us. Member of Parliament and Vice Chairman of Government Feedback Unit, REACH, Mr. Baey Yam Keng is here. Property Analyst and Chief Executive of Property Agency, Century 21 Singapore, Swee Yong is here as well. Principal Pension Consultant at PwC Asia Actuarial Services, Marcus Kwok joins us. So let's get down to business. I know the Prime Minister announced many changes to the CPF. Not many, but there were significant changes, such as greater flexibility. He also highlighted how many Singaporeans have significant savings within their flats, which can be unlocked in their retirement. He talked about right-sizing, renting out rooms, turning to the lease buyback scheme. A few months on, how has all of this really been received by the Singaporeans that you've been communicating with, Mr. Baey?
Well, what has been announced with the details will be the enhanced lease buyback scheme. I do notice there have been some interest among the senior citizens to find out more about the scheme, but I don't think many are taking up. I think as what Minister Kaur is saying, it also shows that people are not that in need of money to want to sort of sell back the lease to the government. So I think that's a good sign in a way, but I think no more needs to be done to raise awareness of this new scheme, enhanced scheme, so that more can benefit from that.
Okay, lots of Singaporeans asking for greater flexibility, and we know that the Prime Minister did announce an adjustment to the policy to allow those who are aged 65 and over the option to take out part of your CPF savings in a lump sum when you need to, an amount, of course, not exceeding 20% of what's in your account. In the spirit of talking about greater flexibility, some analysts have said that the CPF is just laden with too many objectives: housing, healthcare, education, and retirement, which makes all these discussions about flexibility now necessary. Now, Marcus, you are among those people who've suggested that using CPF funds to pay for housing has actually affected retirement adequacy, and perhaps we need to relook at that policy. Can you perhaps explain where you're coming from?
Yeah, I think, you know, the CPF board was set up in 1955, you know, basically is to fund, you know, retirement needs, you know, when someone get to retirement age. However, you know, as the country, nation progress, what you're seeing is the CPF objective have shifted such quite big in the sense that, you know, more and more items are added into there in terms of housing financing, healthcare, children's education, etc. So at the end of the day, you actually have a system that is kind of loading with a lot of other objectives sitting in there. And at some point, we realize that, you know, the question of retirement adequacy comes in, especially the big chunk of housing financing that is inside CPF. It actually takes away a lot of money from our ordinary account. And by doing that, what is going to happen is a lot of members couldn't leverage on the guarantee returns of the 2.5% or the 4% in a special account to generate more money for your retirement, future retirement needs.
But people might say that because I've been able to use my CPF funds to pay for housing, I've managed to buy the home of my dreams. If I didn't have CPF funds, I would be really cash poor. I wouldn't be able to afford a home. I wonder what Swee Yong thinks of this. Who's Swee Yong?
Certainly the CPF liberalization of use, starting from around 1981, there were a few policy tweaks to allow CPF to be used for our first home and subsequently then liberalized for use on our second property. That has allowed many of us to own real estate. And since when I was in primary school, I think I've grown up learning that Singapore is a landlocked country.
Land
and that
scarce,
getting a piece of real estate and retiring with real estate that is always appreciating is a prudent way of keeping our savings. But perhaps we need to re-examine some of these 40 to 50-year-old tenets. I think some of our earlier assumptions may be wrong. Firstly, Singapore is not short of land. Secondly, when we allowed CPF to be used to buy first property and subsequently raising the limits of what should be used and then allowing CPF to be used for investment properties, I think the realization now, 30-something years later, since 1981, is that perhaps many of us might be retiring with a lot of assets but not enough cash. So now real estate becomes a millstone instead of it being an asset.
Okay, before we talk about whether or not you should be allowed to use CPF for your second or third property, you said Singapore is not short of land. Now, that's something that I think some people have grown up believing that we are.
Well,
land scarce at least, right?
The government has always had their forecasts and numbers always planned well out in advance. Master plans cater for Singapore's growth for another 30 to 50 years. HDB's annual reports every year would be explaining to us, for example, the new town of Punggol. Right now, there may be about 30 to 40,000 residential units. The ultimate goal of Punggol is to build Punggol up to a new town of about 90,000 residential units. And then now we have got even newer new towns that haven't been announced, some of them in Jurong West, Choa Chu Kang, Neo Tiew area. We could potentially easily house 10 million people. We are not short of land.
Yet, housing prices have gone up, and you think this is partly because of the liberalization of the CPF funds, the CPF policy?
In any jurisdiction, if you allow non-cash to be used for ownership of assets, you would be driving up assets value. So CPF is non-cash. Bank loans, for example, would be non-cash. If we allow bank loans to be used, say 90% loan to value ratio for residential properties, you for sure property prices would jump.
Okay, so where exactly do you stand on this? Do you feel that for your first property you should be allowed to use CPF, but anything else perhaps you shouldn't? Or do you feel there should be a cap right from the start of your property buying journey?
So I think now that the whole country and me, we have reached middle age, I think it is a good time now to re-examine ourselves. CPF policy vis-a-vis public housing policy. So should HDB firstly cater to be for all of us to be a shelter, a comfortable home? Once we understand the role of HDB, let's go back to basics. So we look back, re-examine the thinking behind why in 1981 we decided to liberalize CPF use for housing, and then see whether that still applies today.
Okay, so should you see your home as merely a home or an asset? Have we gone a little too far in terms of thinking of it as an asset? Stay with us on 938 Live. We'll continue with Talkback Townhall in just a moment. Welcome back to Talkback Townhall on 938 Live. We're joined today by many of our listeners, as you can tell. If you're not here yet, what are you doing out there? Come here. We are at Lau Pa Sat, Key 18. We've got coffee and breakfast, beautiful buns from Mugiho Bakery, a very nice Japanese bakery, all lined up for you, all laid out for you on beautiful tables. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're talking about retirement adequacy and whether there should be a cap on how much of your CPF funds you can use for housing so that you have more left for retirement. We're talking today with our guests. Marcus Kwok is from PwC Asia Actuarial Services. Real estate analyst Swee Yong joins us. He's from Century 21 Singapore. He's the chief executive. And MP Baey Yam Keng, who is vice chair of the REACH Government Feedback Unit, joins us too. Certainly, we are ready to take some of your questions. We will do that in just a moment. I'd like to find out, Mr. Baey, what you think of what Swee Yong and Marcus have been saying, in a sense suggesting that really we should limit the amount of CPF funds people use for housing.
I think the fact that the tweaks were done to CPF over the decades to allow for education, housing, I think these are responses of government to people's needs. So people say, oh, it's my money in CPF, I can't use it, it's hampering my dream to own a home. And I think it's all these considerations that led to today's system. But I think it's good to review every now and then whether is it working, whether is it meeting the needs of people today, but also to strike a balance, because there are people who have used their CPF, invested in property, their own properties or investment properties. How we cannot just make a U-turn and then it might affect some people adversely.
Yes, because the prices will be affected for sure, rental yields will be affected, and all of us who went ahead and paid quite large sums of money for our homes might then see the prices going down.
But given that now HDB has delinked the prices of new BTO flats from the resale market,
right,
I think that is a good start. That means it's not artificially fueled by easy access to non-cash to purchase a flat. So I think that's the first important tweak in our public housing policy, and that could lead to a lower reliance on CPF to finance. Ultimately, HDB needs to sell flats to people who and make them affordable to the average Singaporean.
What about those who buy flats on the resale market, though? Many people have complained about how those prices can go out of hand, and have in the recent past.
Well, the COV has come down tremendously.
Now, yeah.
And the thing is about property, where I think Swee Yong would know better, there's ups and downs. There's nobody, or not even the government, can guarantee that you always appreciate or that how much return you can make from the property investments. So I think that's where we need to look at what's the primary objective of CPF, of what people's needs are, which is to own your own home. I think
what about the primary objective of public housing, though? That it should be a home more than an asset. So perhaps those of us who are thinking of our HDB flats as assets need to rethink it. Because if you continue using your money and perhaps going a little beyond your means, stretching your dollar in order to pay for a nice home, you might have less left for retirement. However, you have those options of monetizing your flats. So where do you think the fix should come in? At the beginning of the process, when you're buying the home, that cap might help you save some money for retirement? Or do you think you would prefer to fix it later on in your life, where you can use, for instance, the lease buyback scheme to monetize your home? And we want to hear from you here as well. Vic, I believe, has a question, a comment. Go ahead, Vic.
Maybe a comment. So, Bharati, I think it would be more of the latter. I did some, based on anecdotal evidence, the people I know, the friends I know, the customers I know. Not many of us are, unfortunately, financial savvy. Okay? So therefore, which means that investing on bonds or saving up certain amount or putting a fixed deposit, as long as there's cash, they want to withdraw, okay, and they want to spend. So the only source of asset they have is housing. Okay, so if you put a cap, which means when you go back to the basic fundamentals, and if you look at now, I read an article that in 5 years' time, X number of jobs will be displaced because technology will take over. I heard it's 50 over 1,000. So what they have resort to will be the asset. Okay, they want the asset to go up so that they can monetize later. So, but if you put a cap, then you're forcing people who are not savvy to save, which may not be possible based on what I've heard and what I've saw.
Okay, what do you think of that? Marcus, perhaps you could jump in here. So Vic says he prefers monetizing the flat later on instead of, entering the property market with a cap on how much of your CPF funds you can use.
Well, I have no problem people monetizing the flat later on in your life. And I think that is actually quite an important asset as part of your retirement portfolio. However, the question is, it's not that always that easy to liquidate that assets, from housing. So what I'm actually advocating is, right in the front, when we are considering buying a house, we have to actually be a little bit prudent on spending within our means. If I have an income of saying that I can get a 3-room flat instead of going for a 4-room or 5-room, maxing up all my CPF contribution, and at the end I'm landing up with a asset-rich cash pool, then I will have a bigger problem when time comes to retirement and I can't liquidate that thing at the end of the day.
Okay, I think that's something that we certainly need to think about. What are the options available? What will this do ultimately to your purchasing power when it comes to buying a home? We'll be discussing all the implications when we continue on Talkback Townhall. Welcome back to Talkback Townhall, coming to you live from Lau Pa Sat. Many of our listeners joining us today to talk about all the important issues in life, security in retirement being a central one. Now, from next year, of course, the re-employment age will be extended to 67 in the public sector. I know that many of us want to work longer, but would we do it if we had a choice? For instance, if we had enough for retirement, how can you make your CPF work better for you to meet your retirement needs? We've been discussing whether there should be a cap on how much of your CPF you can use for housing and for other needs, leaving you more for retirement. And this might mean lowering your expectations of the type of home you live in. Is that something you are willing to accept? We're joined today by Member of Parliament and Vice Chairman of Government Feedback Unit, REACH, Mr. Baey Yam Keng, Property Analyst and Chief Executive of Property Agency Century 21 Singapore, Swee Yong joins us as well, and Marcus Kwok is Principal Pension Consultant at PwC Asia Actuarial Services. We've been talking about the pros and cons of putting a cap on CPF funds that can be used for housing. Marcus, how exactly would this cap work? What exactly are you thinking of in terms of the percentage that can be used for housing?
Actually, I've written articles actually putting a cap as in a certain percentage, but it can work in various ways. You can actually a dollar limit cap too. But take for example, if it's a percentage cap, if let's say we have a 50% caps on your ordinary account to be used for housing, for someone who entered the workforce at age 20 and is at a medium incomes of about 2,500, and at some point at age 30, he decided to say, okay, I'm getting married, I'm going to buy a new house, and go out and get a loan of $300,000 loans, for example. Now, a $300,000 loans, the monthly payment is probably about, the annual amount is probably about 12,400, let's say. Now, if you will have half of that coming from CPF, the other half coming out of your own pocket, which is about $520 a month out of your own pocket, then it's going to change your CPF increase in your CPF saving of a difference of about $15,000 a year when you retire at age 62. So you can see there's a tremendous increase in the saving if you use less of your CPF from your ordinary account.
And some people might say that my CPF is just sitting there locked up anyway. Who knows if I will even be able to enjoy it in my retirement? Why not unlock it now to buy a nicer house? And if I do need money when I hit retirement age, I can just unlock the value of my flat then. Mr. Baey, I want your views on this. Obviously, there are several options.
I think, yes, some people might wishfully think that, yes, when I retire, I will sell my flat, I will move out, I'll downsize, which is currently the options given to the public. But I think what we are facing is that a lot of elderly are very attached to the estate, the community that they live for decades. And it's very difficult for them to say, I just plug myself out and move to a new place. It's very unsettling. So it may not be so easy as it seems.
Yeah, so by virtue of that, don't you think Marcus's suggestion that has also been made by other analysts might be a better idea? You put a limit right from the beginning so that people have more for retirement later on without having to monetize their flat, so to speak. I just want to get a view from the audience on this before we come back to you about this, Mr. Baey.
Okay, hi, good morning. I'm Siak Lim here. Okay, I think I probably have a few comments lah. The first comment, the first comment that I have is, I think I totally agree with Mr. Baey. You know, the idea that you are willing to downgrade when you retire, I think is not realistic. Most people that I know are not quite willing to downgrade. So, on your question on, is retirement more important, a comfortable retirement more important than staying in a comfortable home more important? I think if you think rationally, I will feel that a comfortable retirement is more important. But the problem is, a comfortable retirement is something that we are speaking about 20, 30 years later,
Yes.
Whereas so we are talking about instant gratification of staying in a comfortable house versus a delayed gratification of having a comfortable retirement 20, 30 years down the road. So I think instant gratification will always,
Override
delayed gratification almost all the time.
Thank you very much, Siak Lim, for expressing that. I've brought this up before, that the money is just sitting there. I might as well use it to live in a comfortable home. And what happens when I retire, I'll think about when the time comes. Mr. Baey, you yourself said that it's been harder, or rather it can be difficult for people to uproot themselves in their older age to monetize their flats. So don't you think perhaps Marcus's suggestion, which has been made by several other analysts, might be a better alternative than the system we have now?
For that to work, I think there needs to be two changes. One is the HDB must take the lead in terms of making flats affordable based on the new financing options. All right, and that must be the primary objective of the government, to provide housing for people, right? So if you are not able to use the maximum or whatever amount you can have your CPF to finance your housing loan, then the prices of housing must reflect that. So that's one.
Yes.
Secondly, is the mindset of people. Nowadays, young people like to maximize. The first flat they apply for is a 5-room, EC, but when there are just a couple of them, they just don't really need the space. They should actually look at their parents, the grandparents' generation, and say, okay, I start from maybe a 2-room or even 3-room flat, and then upgrade as the family expands. But I think people are now shortcutting that process. So that must be changed as well, so that we don't overcommit at the onset.
Well, putting a limit on how much of your funds you can use, how much of CPF you can use, might actually inadvertently help them live more within their means or be a little more modest with what they can afford. But then again, they might say, I live in Singapore, I need a nicer lifestyle. So many issues here. I'd like to go to the audience now. I understand, sir, you have a question or comment. Your name, sir?
I'm Lim. I just want to say that for those on the point of investment properties, for those who had bought an investment property, and that seems to be providing a good source of passive income in terms of rental income, and also a good hedge against inflation. Perhaps Mr. Koo can enlighten us on the reality on the ground on this.
Swee Yong, go ahead.
The assumption is correct, provided your property value is always increasing. Right now, we are facing within the next 4 years, a supply of 200,000 HDB and private apartments that will be completed. So within the next 4 years, what happens if your asset value is dropping, and at that same time, you happen to be a retiree who is depending on rental income, but instead, you are having to foot interest expenses rather than collect rental income. So at 68 years old, when you are thinking that this second property investment, next year TOP, you can collect $3,000 a month of extra minus of your...
It may not actually happen, which means your retirement will be in jeopardy.
And subsequently, if you were in a very tight financial situation and you are forced to somehow just liquidate that property, would you be able to take the loss? And at that time in your life, I don't think that is a very wise move.
You certainly don't want to have to deal with that. Swee Yong, let's talk about what a policy like that might do to housing prices. Because I think the fear is that if there's a cap, I'll have to buy a smaller home. I may not be able to get a dream home, so on and so forth. But if there were a cap, wouldn't housing prices also be affected to the point that you might actually be able to afford quite a nice home with limited funds, with fewer funds?
I don't think our authorities, if they were going to implement some form of a cap or a restriction, would apply it to everybody who is a CPF contributor today. You could always stagger it. You could always apply it to the cohorts. So, for example, anybody who is 21 years old from next year, for example, then you apply a cap on their ability to purchase. So don't don't implement a policy which penalizes current homeowners or people who are right now having done their financial planning, paying for their own homes using CPF. Suddenly you apply a cap to them and they have got to then scramble to look for additional cash resources.
Yeah, that wouldn't be fair either.
I don't think our government officials are.
Mr. Baey, can you respond to that?
I think certainly. So the other point about any changes, we need to look at the impact on existing CPF members,
Yes.
commitments that are made already. And I think Swee Yong's suggestion about, applying at a certain cohort and giving advance notice, maybe not 21 years next year, but maybe 3 years or 5 years from now, so that people can start thinking about it and adjusting their plans, their aspirations, and accordingly.
Now, Marcus, you've also been an advocate of employer-sponsored retirement plans. Since we are talking about maximizing your retirement funds, tell me more about how this might work.
Yeah, I think when you talk about retirement planning, we should not just look at just one pillar. And unfortunately, in Singapore, we're so used to relying on CPF as our sole retirement pillar that we totally forgot that there are actually other ways that you can create your retirement aid nest. Now, I actually advocate for occupation scheme, which is actually also called as an employer-sponsored scheme. I'm not asking the government to tell all the employers to have one of these plans, but I think the government should put in certain measure, certain regulation to make this thing easier for employers to set up. And once that is easy to set up, then let the market decide whether do they want to set up one of these plans for their employees. It could be good for retention, which is always a big issue in all companies trying to retain their employees. Let the market dictate.
Okay, so several suggestions already made. Mr. Baey, I know that a committee has been set up, a panel has been set up, the CPF advisory panel, to come up with ways on how to inject more flexibility into the system. Which of our suggestions today you think would be or could be seriously considered by this committee?
Well, definitely the ideas, suggestions will be taken note of. In fact, Rich is taking notes of today's discussion. This will be given to the committee, and I'm sure when the committee is deliberating on its options, there will be also sessions, public consultation sessions, to invite more ideas from the public.
Swee Yong, in closing, tell us what you think should be the strategies to be employed going forward in order to ensure that people can aspire to can get the homes they aspire to, as well as have enough for retirement. Can we have our cake and eat it too?
I want to roll back the discussion to say that in order to create a good strategy for the next 50 years for our retirement, let's look at the numbers. What are we exactly talking about? How many families are we talking about? As we look at our demographics and we extrapolate for the next 20 years, how much CPF accounts are being affected? How many families are at risk? Because for all we know, we might be so prosperous that this discussion is moot because we don't have many families living on the edge.
Okay, so more research in that arena. Mr. Baey, can we expect that to happen? What do we know so far? What more needs to be done in order to find out the facts that might help the government shape CPF policy better?
Well, the government definitely will have access to data of CPF members, their utilization of their savings, and how they are using it for housing or other needs. And that would be able to help guide the panel now to make, I think, valid and very meaningful proposals to tweak the system.
Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. Many thanks also to our listeners for joining us today and for asking your questions, expressing your views. Our guests today were Member of Parliament and Vice Chairman of Government Feedback Unit, REACH, Mr. Baey Yam Keng, Mr. Swee Yong, a property analyst from property agency Century 21 Singapore, and Principal Pension Consultant at PwC Asia Actuarial Services, Marcus Kwok. Thank you so much for joining us on Talkback Townhall. Really appreciate it.